Chapter 5: Social Reform in the Progressive Era. The Progressive Movement focused on many social reforms, including limited immigration, limited child labor, developing safe work conditions, and providing unemployment insurance. In the early stages of industrial society, immigrants bore the brunt of industrialization. Few policies existed to protect people from disease, poverty, disability, discrimination, crime, fires, and poor living conditions. The U.S. was so focused on the political power of corporations and upward mobility that social reform seemed unlikely. However, a depression occurred from 1893 to 1896, and Americans started to question the power of industry. Reformers attested that life should be about cooperation and that unregulated economic activity caused social distress with too much power held by elites. Major progressive reforms focused on expansion of voters' power and regulation of bank and economic institutions, conditions of employment, food and drugs, employment of children, and housing. Some policy reforms were put in place for certain groups. Women received mother's pension and policies to limit their conditions of work and the kind of work they could do. For children, there was the establishment of juvenile courts and the Children's Bureau. Other policy reforms included workers' compensation, aftercare for individuals released from mental asylums, and the 16th Amendment, which established a federal income tax. Health reforms were enacted, such as public health centers and public health inspections for housing, restaurants, and other businesses. However, progressive social reforms were limited. There was a lack of government funding for policy reforms. Political parties didn't focus on the needs of workers, low-income people, or oppressed groups. Reformers were nonpartisan and tried to gain support from both parties, which resulted in not having control over either party. Both parties had strong conservative wings in the progressive era. After losing the Republican nomination, Theodore Roosevelt, a supporter of social reform, ran for president as a third-party candidate of the Bull Moose Party. Sadly, he lost the election. Jane Addams was likely the most well-known reformer of the progressive era. She was a key leader of the Progressive Party and the founder of the social work profession. She founded the Hull House, a settlement house that aimed to introduce middle-class individuals to the life of the urban poor. It provided policy advocacy for the surrounding area and served as a focal point for national reform. Prejudice was still rampant in the progressive era. Many reformers even held racist values. Immigrants were valued as cheap labor, and there was fear that they would dilute the Anglo-Saxon race. Most immigrants lived in poverty, worked for low wages, and suffered harsh working conditions. Women were still tied down by traditional notions of their role in society. However, many women were key leaders in the progressive movement. Suffrage became the main reform issue of the women's movement, which was granted to them by the 19th Amendment in 1920. More married women worked, and more women worked in industry. By the 1920s, social work was an active profession. There were two factions: settlement workers that focused on reform, and charity workers that focused on casework. Casework became the social work science. It was less controversial, and there was more training available. Progressives expanded social policies and obtained remarkable successes given the barriers they faced. However, it should be viewed as modest compared to contemporary society, because it focused on the state and local level of government rather than the federal level. Policies that have continued include certain regulations, mothers' pensions, workers' compensation, establishment of the social work profession, women's suffrage, a national network of hospitals, and juvenile courts.
Created using Powtoon.